So welcome to the fourth lecture series for public management, where we talk about organizations in transition. In particular, we're going to be thinking about how we characterize organizational episodes or sequences of events. So if you can imagine that in week 2, we talked a lot about how we characterize work processes of an organization. In last week, we talked about organizational establishment, or the ways that we characterize the people within an organization and the structural patterns of interaction that exist between them. Now what we're thinking about is how change can occur over time. So you might start off with one type of organizational process and end up with another one, or sometimes you might have a failed attempt to change. In order to do this, in other words, we need to have both initial and ending conditions of an episode and the sequence of events that lies in between them. We'll also be talking a little bit about some specific technical terminology associated with the policy cycle and the innovation cycle, and also a lot about how, in essence, explanation works. So how we unpack that black box of sequences of events and think about the micro-level mechanisms that work within psychology and social interaction that say why some conditions lead to different outcomes than other conditions. So just to be clear, our definition then is of an organizational episode is a social process or set of events that unfolds over time. In essence, by saying we're going to study and attempt to, say, implement a policy, or we're going to study, in the case of the Michigan case last week, we're going to try to understand a failed attempt to change the budgeting process. We're basically setting the limits of the phenomena under study, where you have an initial budgeting process, and then at the end you have either a changed or unchanged process. So what we can imagine then is that we can represent this using our typical input-output graph, similar to what we used in to talk about organizational enterprises. So we basically have initial conditions and final conditions. The sequence of events is that black box in the middle. And the conditions, I should point out, can be establishment conditions. They can be enterprise conditions. So we can think about using technical language from our first 2 weeks. In essence, what we're talking about this week is thinking about how we characterize that change over time, not the other types of establishment and enterprise conditions that are there or that might change themselves over time. So, for example, in the Michigan case from last week, we can imagine the transition condition is a difficult and fractious budgeting process. Ideally, right, one might think that the outcome, at least by residential life that was desired, would have been a cooperative, community-centered budgeting process centered around buildings. And the idea was supposed to be that there were these student-focused building managers who would sort of step up, take charge of the budgeting process, take some ownership over the buildings, etc. We could think in more detail about that transition, but that's a rough way to describe it. Of course, as we know, that wasn't what actually happened. So those might have been the desired outcomes, but in fact, the actual outcomes was a failed attempt to change the budgeting process. And what we have is something that we might want to characterize as dynamic stability. In essence, there was a strong level of interference and resistance that kept these desired changes, or at least desired by some people, changes from occurring. So again, this is the sort of very simple form of how we think about transition events. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that we might want to think a little bit about are the problem-solving and innovation cycles, because much as we have Mintzberg to talk about the establishment, or terms like demand and supply-driven work to think about enterprise, the problem-solving cycle and innovation cycle become one way we can think about characterizing different stages that we're in during a transition episode in which we're trying to change, an organizational change episode. So this is a fairly typical problem-solving cycle that you might encounter in other classes. This particular one is from Van Aken. In essence, where you start off with something of a problem mess, where you have not a very clearly defined problem. You then specify the problem. You do some analysis and diagnosis in order to develop a plan of action. You then actually conduct the intervention, and then you evaluate afterwards. So this is just sort of the names that one might apply to the different steps that one might take during a problem-solving episode. If you've learned much about the policy cycle, you'll see that these are very similar to what we just looked at. So you basically have agenda setting is the equivalence of sort of problem specification. The analysis and diagnosis tends to take place during the alternative policy specification. You then adopt it, you implement it, and then you evaluate it. So again, these are just words. So we think about the evaluation stage or the implementation stage. These are just ways that we describe where we are at during a transition episode. One of the interesting things that engineers have done is they've actually gone a little bit further in thinking about not just the cycle steps, but also what are the actual, in essence, concrete objects that have to get produced in order to keep us moving along these processes. So if you can imagine that we start off with something like this fuzzy front end of a design process, which is where we're in this problem mess, right? Where, as we know, with a complex system, there are many possible solutions. There are also many possible, therefore, reasons that things might go wrong. So there might be people saying, well, I think this is a problem and this is the solution. So in essence, the naming the problem is one of these huge leaps where you've already had to get a lot of political buy-in, that everyone agrees that what you say is the problem is the problem. And in fact, part of what you tend to see, and we might want to think about seeing in this week's case, for example, in NIOSH is, there is a problem named, but at some point that problem has to be renamed. And so thinking about why that is, what causes, in essence, so people see the problem one way, other people see it another way. So we have to think about how we move back and forth between this fuzzy front end and the actual magic wand where the designer says, aha, now I have your solution. And of course, the solution is actually going to encompass basically 3 distinct parts. We might design the process for designing the solution itself. Again, we typically have these process designs in order to make sure that the solution, you get political buy-in for it, you actually ensure that the group that is sort of tasked with designing a solution might have the power and the authority to do it, that they have access, that they don't overstep their bounds. There's all sorts of ways that one might want to design the process, that there are clear milestones so they can report back. But then once a group gets tasked with this process design of how they're going to actually go about solving the problem, they then need to come up with an object design, i.e. a new set of features, but also the realization design, how those features are going to get implemented. The realization design might include things like piloting or bringing managers into a meeting, getting initial buy-in, and then sort of having a larger rollout, media events, etc. We'll be seeing more of that idea of realization design in later weeks. But just remembering that there's, in essence, even when you think, well, all I have to do is go solve the problem, part of the idea of this graphic is, in fact, you need a process by which you're going to get sort of other people to come into the problem-solving process. There's the object design itself, and there's also how that object design gets actually implemented in real time to ensure that it works. So you can imagine that part of what happens in Michigan is it's not ever clear as a process design or a realization design. We only see this object design, which is a fairly poorly specified one at that, right? For, well, we're just going to have this new budgeting process, but not a lot of thinking about how it's going to get implemented, how it's going to be overseen, how people are going to be checking in on it. So in essence, if you don't get this first stage, sort of the rest of it comes to no end. Now, one thing to point out, of course, is that this problem mess, there tends to be a lot of problems and solutions floating around. So again, as I said, you can imagine that in the case of this week, we actually see different people are calling the problem different things. And so part of the big trick is to get everyone to agree on a single definition of the problem they can all buy into. It may not be the preferred definition. Some people might want to think ADSO is a bad manager. ADSO might want to think her boss is driving her crazy and that these people don't give her enough respect. But they need to come up with a definition of the problem they can all buy into that might alleviate some of the stresses or strains or other conditions that cause everyone to agree that some type of action needs to be taken. So just again, to revisit, we've got these different aspects of the process design, object design, and realization design. And again, there is the realization process itself. So if you want to recap here for what the actual definitions are, the process design becomes a design of the process of analysis and design that is designed to produce this object in realization design. And again, keep in mind that the object design may not be a concrete object like a plane or a widget, but could also be a basically a proposal like the Junta proposal for how, a new process for how they manage transfer order requests, right? So that could be itself its object design. The realization design might say, well, we're going to start off by starting to transfer money around, and for the first 6 months, we're going to be checking banks until we are pretty sure we've eliminated all the interbank transfers by having these historical records, right? So it might not be that they get it all done right away, but they might have a 6-month or 1-year staged implementation in order to move enough money around and have enough checks to cash. So that is the object design. The process design just says how they're going to actually go out and do it. So in the case of Junta, it's just one guy sort of figures it out, and then he gets a little bit of buy-in from his managers and moves on. But in the case of larger sort of process re-engineering projects or design projects, you often need a more elaborated design. The realization process design, again, is this idea of how you're going to actually be realizing it. And then there's a realization process itself, which is basically implementation. So what types of interventions might affect whether or not there is actual change? So there can be design features, like the process design could actually, some process designs could just be structurally wrong, right? Trying to push, we saw in the Michigan case, trying to push authority down in a case where you didn't really need a divisionalized form, the environmental conditions weren't right, and where there were other types of things that undermined middle manager authority, did not work at all. So we had a good feeling that that was the object design itself wasn't going to work. There's also the process design. So in the case of Michigan, that would be if there hadn't been good buy-in from facilities, and mostly this was something that residential life was trying to force on them, then we might see things like them going on later to interfering because they hadn't really bought into the proposed solution. And again, an implementation plan, to the extent that's missing, that can cause problems. The process features that might occur are something like a timeline or set of events that occur. So we see certain events occurring that actually undermined, like removing people from one building and moving them to another. And sometimes you might just simply get exogenous or endogenous. So exogenous events are just things that happen, like all of a sudden there's, a financial crisis and the money that was initially available is not there anymore. Some of these things are more endogenous, like if you haven't involved people in the process design, they're probably going to try to interfere with your implementation during the process itself.